that CBD probably exerts its activity in our skin, and that's what we're focusing on,
Mhm.
skin, hair, and nails, but in other systems. CBD can prevent DNA damage from ultraviolet radiation, which is linked to accelerated skin aging. So by definition, we should be able to prevent accelerated skin aging. If it says that it's meant to treat a medical condition, that should be a huge red flag because that is not okay. That is a drug claim.
Welcome to Derm-It Trotter. Don't swear about skincare, where host Dr. Shannon C. Trotter, a board-certified dermatologist, sits down with fellow dermatologists and skincare experts to separate fact from fiction and simplify skincare. Let's get started.
Welcome to the Derm-It Trotter Don't Swear About Skincare podcast. Today, I have a great guest. He's a repeat guest on the podcast. He loved it so much, he had to come back. Professor and Chair of Dermatology, Residency Program Director, and Director of Translational Research at the GW at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. I've got Dr. Adam Friedman back with me here today. Welcome to the podcast, Adam.
So just when I thought I got out, you pulled me back in.
I
got to use that famous line, right?
Exactly. Well, this was something actually Adam wanted to talk to me about. So we'll have to find out what his interest is in talking about CBD and skin. So I think a lot of people out there are thinking, what, is there a purpose for this? And as you know all too well, there is a potential role here for our patients. So I want to get right into the meat of this because a lot of people are thinking marijuana and skin, that's CBD. How's this really going to work? Is it really beneficial? And what are the differences? Because a lot of people, no, that's something that's controlled or you can get high from it. Or what's the difference between that and THC? So we're going to have you break it down a little bit so people really understand the difference.
Yeah, so let's start with CBD or cannabidiol. It is one of hundreds of cannabinoids found in the cannabis plant. And before we even go further, I got to say it's hilarious that we have learned so much about the human system from an illegal substance, right? Like when in history did you have a drug really changing our perception, our understanding of human biology? And then, of course, at the end of the day, potential targets and translations for therapies that can improve the human condition. So just got to throw it out there, a gold star for illicit drugs. But right, so CBD is one of many. And I think what most people are aware of is THC, because that's the one that gets you high. I like to say CBD is kind of like the nerdy sibling doing all the homework, doing the biology and the science in the background, not going to the parties where, of course, THC is the one that can be intoxicating, where CBD is not intoxicating. Actually, pure CBD will not make you feel high in any way that THC can. Now, the reason for this is the biology. So we all have endocannabinoid system. Now, that this was all discovered, as I mentioned before, thanks to the study of ingredients from the cannabis plant. But in essence, we have this unique system that is involved in probably every biological process in our bodies. Now, historically, we defined two ways that cannabinoids, things from the cannabis plant, and there are other types of cannabinoids besides the plant-derived ones, and we'll talk about them. But there are two historic ways that this can happen, do something biologically. One is through the CB1 receptor, which is the receptacle in the central nervous system to which THC binds very tightly. And when THC binds to the CB1 receptor, this is what drives euphoria, altered perception, impaired coordination, maybe making bad decisions, who knows. Whereas CBD has actually a very low affinity, actually barely any affinity for the CB1 versus CB2, which is expressed on immune cells among other cells in our body. But even then, it doesn't bind super strongly. In fact, we now know that CBD probably exerts its activity in our skin, and that's what we're focusing on, skin, hair, and nails, but in other systems, through various other receptors, some on, actually even on nerves called vanillinoid receptors, which are a hot area in dermatology. These receptors have been implicated in certain conditions like rosacea or even in itch and pain. There's some nuclear receptors inside our cells called PPARs that regulate how the cell makes itself, wound healing, how hair makes itself. But there's a whole host of different what are called G protein coupled receptors that CBD can bind to, which is one of the reasons why it potentially can have so many beneficial effects. However, none of these receivers have anything to do with psychoactive effects, which is why CBD will not create the same type of experience that THC can. You mentioned legality,
Mm-hmm.
and that I think is a big piece of this. So one, I think one of the big interests in this area is because anything historically from the cannabis plant was considered illegal.
Right.
So of course, if someone says you can't have it, you want it, right? So that allure of like, ooh, it's cannabis, yeah,
Right.
it's like right, like you're like people like, tell me more. Um, the funny thing is that kind of changed recently. So hemp derived cannabidiol, which means it's cannabis with less than 0.3% of delta 9 THC by dry weight. So you're talking about a part of the plant that is a very low amount of THC under the 2018 Farm Bill is considered federally legal. So if you are making a CBD product derived from this piece, it is considered quote unquote legal. Now, if you're pulling CBD from plants with a greater THC concentration
Mm-hmm.
or parts of the flower, then it's still considered controlled under federal level, even if your state allows it. So there's
Okay.
state control and then
Mm-hmm.
federal control and oversight. And we've seen over the years the expansion of medical marijuana in terms of being able to access a dispensary. There are actually fewer states that don't allow it than do nowadays, which is pretty remarkable. But then there's access recreationally in terms of just, buying it wherever. So that does vary from state to state. But the hard part is that even under that farm bill with hemp derived CBD, the FDA does not consider CBD to be a legal dietary supplement or a food ingredient. And so when the farm bill went into effect, there was this massive explosion. You probably remember, like everyone and their mother had a
Oh, yeah.
CBD product, CBD shampoo,
Yep.
CBD smoothie, CBD elixir of life. Like it makes you think like Zoolander, like CBD is the essence of life, and life is CBD. I don't know, some stupid thing
Exactly.
like that. Was that a good Zoolander
That was
imitation?
excellent. That was impressive. I like that. Yeah.
Like I'll give you Blue Steel later on in the interview. So, the FDA went kind of crazy because, and rightfully so, because all these companies like saw the floodgates open and they made all these products, and the FDA issued like over 60 warning letters to companies making drug-like claims or putting CBD in food or gummies that were easily accessible over the counter. Now, where things are actually pretty kosher, all said and done, is going to be in cosmetics. So hemp derived
Mm-hmm.
CBD are allowed to be utilized in topical formulations, but they do have to follow all the typical safety rules of an over-the-counter cosmeceutical, which falls under the FDCA. And again, if you're making medical claims, then you can certainly get into some trouble. The big issue, though, and this has been highlighted in the literature twice now, in that many of these products will say they have one thing, and it's a total misdirect. That many of these products either have more or less CBD than are actually listed, and also many of them will have THC in them, let alone impurities and God knows what else. There have been several case reports of irritant contact dermatitis,
Mm-hmm.
pesticide poisoning from some of these poorly regulated products. So it's been the wild, wild west, which has really undermined the space. And I think we saw like a bell curve of like everyone's super excited. We even published data on like the overall consumer interest and physician interest in learning more. And then it peaked, and then people lost interest because they were frustrated by the lack of quality products that had
Mm-hmm.
evidence supporting their use. And so it kind of fell down, and it went off the cliff. And my hope is that we can reinvigorate it with good science, which is some of the work we're doing.
Well, that's exciting because I know a lot of people out there have been interested in it. And you're right. When that craze caught on, everyone was looking for CBD this or hemp oil this, and everyone was jumping on the bandwagon. And I think when you talk about the legalities of it, that's really hindered some of the research, why we don't have great studies. And the challenge now, do you feel like with less regulation or more regulation, that'll make it better for research going forward? Like, how are you able to do the research you're trying to do with all the restrictions that surround it?
So research wise, it's become easier. So when I first got into the space, which, oh man, when was this? This was before the Farm Bill. I know that much because at that time, getting CBD and working within the lab would have been very difficult. So what we actually started with was actually something called anandamide, which is, or AEA, which is
Mhm.
an endocannabinoid. So I mentioned that we, right now, you and I, we are making endocannabinoids that are binding to the CB1 and CB2 receptors, controlling sensation, inflammation, cell turnover. So AEA, you can literally buy super easily from like Sigma, for example,
Mhm.
these, these companies that sell lab grade materials. So that's what I started with when I got interested in this space, serendipitously, because one of my residents, shared a paper that she worked on with Vicki Worth at Penn. And I'm like, oh, this is kind of cool. And she made the comment to me, well, you can't deliver them topically because they're lipophilic, they like fatty
Mhm.
environments, and they're big, so they can't get through the skin. And so you know me, I'm like, ah, challenge accepted. Let's party, because delivering on deliverables is one of my areas of research using nanotechnology.
Mhm.
And so with that, at that point, we're like, yeah, we can't get access to CBD to do research. Let's do AAA. But now, yes, I think it actually is easier to work with CBD. THC still that comes with some challenge. I
Mhm.
personally have done no in vitro translational research with THC, but CBD I can actually access pretty easily and work with it in the lab, animal studies, and even in humans without much red tape. So that I think has become a little bit easier.
So if folks are out there suffering, with acne, eczema ish, like what kind of data is out there about how it may help with those conditions? And or do we have at least some preliminary, do we have some decent studies for any of those conditions to really support some of those claims?
So the answer is yes and no. So from looking at a million mile high view with respect to clinical data, we do have some small studies looking at, for example, there were two studies I can think of off the bat with a CBD gel for whether it be just kind of like asteatotic eczema, or like really dry, irritated skin, or even atopic dermatitis, using validated scoring tools to monitor change over time. Acne, actually, there was a Journal of Clinical Investigation paper. JCI is like one of the top tier basic science journals looking at CBD and how it potentially could be useful for acne. And what they found was pretty remarkable. So CBD can, one, inhibit sebum production. We have very few drugs that inhibit sebum production. And two, it really interfered with the kind of, maybe I would call it the match that sets off the inflammatory cascade that leads to an inflammatory nodule or cystic nodule, by interfering with what's called the inflammasome, which is a gatekeeper of inflammation that is overactive in the setting of acne. So we had a really nice mechanistic study. There have been several small clinical trials, nothing amazing, but certainly supportive to look into it. Psoriasis, it's interesting. So when medical marijuana first came about and every state would indicate, all right, these are the things you can write a card. A physician could write a
Mhm.
card for someone to go to a dispensary to get marijuana or medical cannabis. Psoriasis was on there for several states. And there are several studies now. There was one, about a 50-person study looking at a CBD shampoo for scalp psoriasis. There have been subsequent studies also looking at this. And from a mechanistic standpoint, it would make sense how CBD or other cannabinoids, through binding to their receptors, could be anti-inflammatory. Or maybe a better way to position it, it's not that it's anti-inflammatory for any of these, but rather it's pro-resolution of inflammation. And that's a very unique concept in dermatology.
Mhm.
We're all about blocking a signal, blocking a receptor. We're anti-inflammation. Whereas when CBD binds to its specific receptors, these G protein coupled receptors, it actually turns on a whole bunch of things and turns off a bunch of things. So what's called the resolvin pathway, very appropriately named, when you hit one of these resolvin receptors, it actually kind of, it's almost like the maestro, right? It's like, all right, you have to be loud over here to kind of cool off inflammation,
Mhm.
and you need to now repair over here. So it really orchestrates turning off an inflammatory environment and then signaling for cells to polarize to the type that actually repair, which is much different than blocking a signal and waiting for things to cool off on their own. So I think that cannabinoids, especially CBD, have so much potential as pro-inflammation resoluting factors. It's just we need more clinical data to support that. Even, when we think about androgenic alopecia, hair loss, there are preclinical studies showing that it could be useful there. The big things are where, like, how much, how do you
Mhm.
deliver it, and for how long? I think those are really some of the biggest issues. But for me, I mean, the area that I think is the best studied, and full disclosure, I'm saying this because it was my study with one of my mentors,
You can
Brian
do your own
Berman.
one. It's okay.
Really, it's the best if I did it. There's so many different adjectives I could use to describe myself in saying that. I actually want to hit myself in the face for sounding so pompous. But I am actually really proud of this work because we really worked hard to come up with a clinical trial protocol that could meet muster, that would generate data that we would feel very comfortable with, that it was significant, data that we would feel good or not embarrassed about submitting to the Journal of the American Academy of Dermatology. And so this study, which was designed to look at, can CBD protect our skin's DNA from the expected injury from UV radiation? So, very simple question, because we know UVA radiation is the flavor of UV radiation that will cause accelerated skin aging, among other things like skin cancer, which we as dermatologists worry about. But it is directly linked to photoaging. And so we want to see if we blasted someone with 3 times the amount of UVA radiation that you would need to even get a burn, and it's hard to burn someone with UVA, truthfully, could we protect the skin? And we used a couple different measures to say yes or no. We looked at histology. We took pieces of people's skin and looked at histology. We looked at, did the skin thicken in response to that injury? Did we see nuclear damage? We can stain the nuclei of our skin cells. And then we extracted DNA from the tissue to look for what's called the common deletion, which is a mutation that has been well established over the years that results from UVA radiation. And in 50% of subjects, so we had 20 people in the study, 50% did not have this mutation in those who were treated versus, and we used individuals as their own control. So one
Mhm.
side got treatment, one side didn't. We didn't know which. The other side uniformly had this mutation. So what
Right.
that tells us
Mhm.
is that CBD can prevent DNA damage from ultraviolet radiation, which is linked to accelerated skin aging. So by definition, we should be able to prevent accelerated skin aging. And I think this was the most detailed study to date in terms of not just looking at someone, but actually taking tissue. And I mean, it took a year and a half to do all this to really get to the most or nanoscale level to understand how it's behaving.
Well, it's really exciting, because that's where everything's at. A lot of our listeners out there are thinking, the implications beyond even just acne, psoriasis. And if there's an anti aging component here that can be
100%.
integrated into the skincare routine, wow, I mean, that has a lot of promise for the future. Everyone's looking for the next best thing. So you may have just found it here with your study with CBT. So the translation is getting this into a product that then shows that benefit, I think, for patients. Is that kind of where it's headed?
Yeah, so the product we use, so why I was involved in this clinical study is that working with a company called Minnow Labs,
Hmm.
in collaboration with a company that is developed out of a nanotechnology, so nano meaning a billionth of a meter, these invisible little carriers. The idea was, okay, we know CBD does a whole lot, only if it gets where it needs to be. How you deliver something is probably just as, if not more important than how something works in the living system. So we combined this with a drug delivery system that I developed as a medical student with my father at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. So
Hmm.
nice little family story tier. So combining, quality CBD with a drug delivery system that we know can get through the stratum corneum, the outer layer of the skin, and release things over time, it was a perfect marriage. And so we do have a product on the market that was used in this clinical study. So the purpose of the study was to prove that if you deliver CBD the right way, it can have a benefit, which goes back to the original question about, okay, there was this wild west of products that came out. How do you know what
Hmm.
even works?
Exactly.
Well, you need a clinical trial to prove that it works. And that was the purpose here, was to prove that this particular product called C Elements MD does actually have a biological impact.
So somebody's out there thinking, okay, I buy it. CBD has benefit in the skin. I get it's anti-inflammatory. Potentially, I want to use a CBD product. how do you advise patients or the consumer out there because of the lack of research if they're trying to really pick something up that they think could have benefit? And you're right, too, from the delivery standpoint, if that hasn't really been studied for that particular product, how do you guide patients in that conversation?
Yeah, I think that is probably the $1 million question, because you walk into probably any major, I call it drugstore. I mean, that's kind of like I probably aging myself. Like a CVS or Walgreens, and you could probably find
You go on
CBD.
Amazon, Adam. You go on Amazon.
Oh my God! Wow, you actually go to a store? Like, what is wrong with you? Like, yes, I look at the papers and I want to watch my program at 7
Get your
p.m. and go to
coupons
sleep by
out.
8.
Yeah.
I do collect Social Security, apparently. So, uh, so a couple things. So the practical filters I use, and I tell my patients to use, is first look for third-party testing. So there's something called a certificate of analysis, or COA, that
Mhm.
is from an independent lab that often will be linked to a QR code or a batch number on the product. And I think that one easy thing is, if you're looking at a product and it's not clear, reach out to the company, ask for their COA.
Okay.
If they do not give it to you, they don't respond, you have your answer. The other is transparent labeling. So, do they put the exact milligrams of CBD per container?
Mm.
Clear ingredient list, realistic claims. I think that's true,
Mhm.
honestly, for anything. If anything sounds too good to be true that's over the counter, it has to be.
Mhm.
This is when we think about peptides and natural ingredients, nutraceuticals. If something sounds too good, it probably is nothing. Nothing changes the appearance or biology of your skin overnight, or permanently. So it is like kind of concept of Rome. Rome wasn't built overnight. So the claims have to be realistic, and that is true for CBD as well. If it says that it's meant to treat a medical condition, that should be a huge red flag, because that is not okay. That is a drug claim. Reputable manufacturer. So does the company follow GMP rules and compliance? Do they have even clinical data? And often, if a company has it, they're going to humble brag about it on their website for sure,
Mhm.
because they invest and they spend time doing it. Does the company have a track record in dermatology? Who do they work with? And are they established, or are they just a pop up? They come out of nowhere, which means they could disappear just as easily. And then last but not least, I think the cosmesis of the product. Certainly trying for yourself. Does it rub in easily? Is there information about stability, for example? I think that's also where patient reports, affirmations, things like that the company might post online, or if you're looking online, people have commented about their experiences. I think that could be helpful at all as well. I mean, clearly that's not scientific, but that certainly can help. But at the end of the day, this should not replace a prescription medication that has been recommended by a dermatologist, by another healthcare practitioner. I consider them as adjuncts, and I use this in my own, like, me personally. I use specifically the nano CBD product I was mentioning, in combination with a retinoid, in combination with sunscreen, because this is not meant to replace sunscreen. It's meant to be its best friend, to kind of pick up the slack where sunscreen drops the ball in terms of allowing for UV damage, which no sunscreen can block 100%. So I think it's about working into a regimen with other things, rather than, oh, this is a one size fits all.
And I think it's really good you comment on that, because a lot of people are looking for always this natural replacement, and just highlighting the fact that that's not always going to be the case. These are nice add-ins, to really
Correct.
enhance your protection, but does give that thought of, coming from, the marijuana plant. It can natural kind of concept, because I think a lot of people want to know, or they assume natural is always better. And especially for, people that
Right.
are pregnant, breastfeeding, what would you say to them about using CBD products? Because a lot of people want to know, is it safe because it's natural if they're actually pregnant or breastfeeding?
Yeah. So first things first, natural does not equal safe.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so glad you brought that up. The way I kind of think about or talk about it is, what happens in nature is chaotic, right? It's imperfect. And very often synthetic is taking what we understand about nature, lessons learned. I mean, there are many medications that we have that are derived from plants, even from things that insects or certain animals secrete or make, but they are created and designed in a way that every batch is reproducible, that no matter how many times you buy something, it's going to be the same each time. The other thing is when we think about natural and safe, there's some pretty nasty natural things out there. Anthrax, actually aflatoxin, which comes from peanuts, is the most toxic substance on the planet. So I think it's important to like push that aside, that it's not all or none, natural versus synthetic. Really, toxicology comes down to concentration, not ingredient, concentration. So water is toxic if you have too much of it, because it will dilute all your electrolytes, your brain will swell, and you'll have like an 80s horror movie moment with your eyes popping out. I mean, that won't really happen, but
Good.
it's like Total Recall, like on Mars. I think that it's not about ingredient, it's about concentration and how something is delivered that actually leads to whether something is safe or not safe. So that's one thing. Now, I am always on the side of erring with some responsibility, or erring with caution, in that if you do not have data, maybe I'll be like the FDA here. If you don't have data on use in pregnancy and breastfeeding, I just say no. I mean, we see that all the time in the indications for drugs. If it wasn't ever studied, pregnancy, breastfeeding, you just say no. Now, in special populations, like kids, like pediatrics, I actually am okay with CBD in this setting. The reason is there have been numerous case reports. There was actually a case series looking at CBD oil for wound healing in an inherited condition called epidermolysis bullosa simplex, which is a horrible condition where in areas of shearing, the skin literally shears off. These kids will get blisters in pressure-dependent areas due to inherited defects in the things that anchor the skin down. And they don't heal well either. So there have been some case series looking at that. There have been other case series looking at CBD and wound healing in general. And we actually published a study surveying pediatric dermatologists in their comfort in recommending CBD-based products or their interest. And there certainly was a lot, and a good number that actually said that they do already. Okay. So in the pediatric, it's not so much about CBD, it's about what product. Does that product have a COA? There was a paper looking at dermal hypersensitivity reaction, allergic reaction to a CBD product, but it wasn't to the CBD. It was actually to an excipient that wasn't even supposed to be in the product. And that's where that COA comes in. Like, what else is coming along for the ride, being a natural source ingredient? Is there some junk that came along that's going to cause problems? And so that's where picking the right product is important. It's not so much about, is CBD dangerous in kids?
So CBD in the future, where are we headed?
Oh man, I'm hoping that we put the paddles on and shocked it back to life, because I remember there was an article in Allure that said "R.I.P. to CBD," and it broke my heart. Someone like I'm like mid clinical trial, and I see this, and I'm like, "Are you kidding me?" And I actually reached out to the author. She actually quoted me related to one of our survey studies about public perception of CBD, and I reached out. I said, "Hey, listen. So I saw your article, didn't love it, but I'm working on something that may change your perspective. Can I reach out when it's done?" And the reporter, the editor said, "Absolutely, thanks." And I got to say, this is a good lesson. I think we often assume that people don't want to hear from us, or that there's this divide. Always reach out if you have something to offer, or you want to connect. If you see something, like especially with media, you'd be surprised 9 out of 10 times they will respond very quickly, and you could create a long-term engagement that can allow for you to get the right information out there. And so we finished the study, we published it in the JAD, and I reached back out, sure enough, and they did a whole article about the revival and how you need to really pursue the scientific method in order to prove claims and points. And so my hope is that we are kind of swinging things around, because I think that it would be a shame not to capitalize on all the incredible work that's been done, first in cells, then in animals, and even in humans. To really get to the next level, we need a whole community of stakeholders invested. And this includes industry as well, to get this to the next level with respect to maybe even at the prescription level. It takes a lot of effort and, of course, funding. There already is a CBD-based drug out there, Epidiolex, which is an oral CBD product for certain types of epilepsy. And we learned a lot about the safety from that. So we know that under 1.5 grams ingested a day is really quite safe. There's no hepatotoxicity, no real issues. So we actually learn a lot about an ingredient when you go through the rigor of an FDA trial. So I really hope those watching it encourage those decision makers to pursue this, to generate the level of data for those in whether it be translational or clinical research to really engage, because I think that there is so much untapped potential. And we focused on photoaging, accelerate skin aging from sun exposure. But I think the things you mentioned before, acne, psoriasis, eczema, wound healing, seborrheic dermatitis, the list goes on and on. There was a company looking at a synthetic cannabinoid called lenabasum, a company called Corbis, for connective tissue diseases like dermatomyositis, scleroderma. There's so much potential here, but you can't skip the line. And I think that's what happened with the Farm Bill. We jumped from A to Z without doing the work. Often a drug takes 20 years from start to finish. You got to put in the work to then have the confidence that this is going to have the effect you want the same way in all patients.
Well, that sounds promising for CBD in the future may hold. So we'll just say we're going out on this podcast on a high. Let's just do that. I love
always. I see what you did there. That was.
I thought you'd like that.
Somewhere a teenager rolled their eyes, but I like it. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Adam, for coming on and giving us kind of an
pleasure.
update of where we're at. I think this will be exciting information for people to pay attention to and to see where CBD takes us into the future, especially with skin.
Yep, absolutely.
And stay tuned for the next episode of Derm-It Trotter, Don't Swear About Skincare.
Thanks for listening to Derm-It Trotter. For more about skincare, visit dermittrotter.com. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with anyone who needs a little skincare sanity. Until next time, stay skin smart.